All right. I reckon we'll probably kick off and then we'll just sort of let other people roll in throughout the session. We did have a few, like I think as Louise said before, 30 people registered for this one. So a few other people might just be a little bit late, but either way, lovely to have the people here that are here. For those who haven't met me, my name is Rachel. I'm the resourcing and recruitment specialist at Pledge Consulting. And I am just going to check, Louise, have you started recording this session?
Yep, the session is being recorded and I'm here to facilitate the chat. So any questions, please drop them into the chat and we'll either take them or we go, or if it's appropriate, I'll hang on and wait till the end. So let's see how we go.
Amazing. All right, perfect. So yeah, as I say, I'm Rachel Hanson. I am the resourcing and recruitment specialist at Pledge Consulting. I partner with organisations to secure the specialist sort of project delivery, PMO, project controls talent that they might need to achieve successful portfolio outcomes and deliver projects better within their organisation. And as part of my role, and with the assistance of the fantastic project management specialists I have working alongside me, on a daily or at least weekly basis, I'm having conversations with my clients about techniques and strategies to manage and appropriately forecast their resourcing needs. Those conversations are actually what prompted the idea for our webinar today, which I have called The Uncomfortable Truth About Resource Management. And while I'm aware each organisation has different processes and approaches to hiring, today I want to reflect on some of my recent observations and experiences with some of my clients as well. All right, so let's get right into it by starting with the problem. Too often, organisations are treating resource management as a one-size-fits-all process. The same hiring approach is being applied regardless of whether the organisation needs a permanent capability for the next 5 years or a specialist for the next 5 weeks. And that matters because when the resourcing approach doesn't match the delivery need, projects pay the price through delays, increased costs, missed milestones, and also pressure on existing teams. A simple example is what I've got here on the slide here, permanent hiring. It's not unusual for a permanent recruitment process to take 2 or 3 months once you factor in notice periods, approvals, recruitment, and assessing for cultural fit. That time frame may be completely appropriate for a long-term hire. But I also see organisations applying that same process when the recruitment is urgent and short-term. So, for example, you're 2 weeks from go live and realise your change team doesn't have the capacity to deliver the activities required. You need specialist support now, potentially in the form of, as I've said here, a 3-month fixed-term contract. But the organisation is trying to solve that problem through a process designed for permanent hiring. I do want to mention that there is obviously a broader conversation around HR, procurement, and internal approval processes. But today I want to focus on what we can influence as project and portfolio leaders, and that is forecasting resource demand earlier, treating it as a continuous activity, and matching the resourcing approach to the actual requirement. And I'll get into all of those things a bit later. Because the reality is that the way you source and deploy capability should change depending on the phase of the project, the maturity of the portfolio, the urgency of the need, and also the specialist nature of the specific work. And that is really the problem I want to unpack today. Resource management becomes ineffective when we treat every requirement the same. And yeah, as I say, over the next 20 minutes or so, I want to look at why that happens, what it costs organisations, and some practical ways we can make better resourcing decisions earlier. Right, let's start with what I most commonly hear and what I'm sure a lot of you have heard before as well. Contractors are too expensive. We need to reduce contingent labour. Let's hire permanent staff instead. We need to cut project costs, and potentially let's use fixed term contractors. And I want to highlight that none of those statements are necessarily wrong, but they're often solving the wrong problem. So if we take a look at the graph that represents resource demand over time within an organisation, and we'll circle back to those statements that I've just gone through a little bit later. I think the next slide it is. The solid purple line represents the level of capability needed across a portfolio over time. And as you can see, it constantly fluctuates. So projects begin and end, new priorities are introduced, programs move into more resource intensive phases, deadlines are brought forward, funding can change, specialist skills are needed for a period, and then that need reduces. So my broader point is that demand naturally rises and falls. The dashed line represents a permanent workforce capacity, and it's relatively fixed, right? Once an organisation has hired its permanent team, that cost and capacity generally remains consistent, even while project demand changes around it. And this creates two very different problems. One, when demand rises above permanent workforce capacity, as you can see on the top left corner of this graph, the organisation becomes under-resourced. This is often where leaders ask existing employees to absorb the additional workload. People are stretched across too many projects, priorities compete with one another, key activities take longer, and deadlines begin to move. And ultimately, quality can suffer. We've all seen it before. Eventually, the conversation becomes, why aren't our projects moving quickly enough? But often the issue is not the performance of the project team. The issue is that the organisation has asked a fixed level of capacity to meet a temporary spike in demand. And there is a real cost to that. You may avoid the visible cost of bringing in another resource, but you can create a much larger and less visible cost through delays, rework, team burnout, missed opportunities, and also benefits being realised later or potentially not at all. Now let's stay with this example for a second. Let's say the organisation does decide to move forward and hire to close the resource demand gap. In this example, where the resource management of a portfolio of work has been poorly or it just insufficiently forecasted, this under-resourcing problem may only be flagged just before or as it happens. And from that point, decisions are made reactively. You may hire an overpriced contractor, and by the time onboarding takes place and the new hire is up to speed, the resource demand peak may have come and gone. I often do think this is where the use of daily rate contractors can get a bit of a bad rap. And then just to quickly touch on, then we have the opposite problem, which you can see in the graph on the bottom right. When demand falls below permanent workforce capacity, some people may become underutilised and skills sit idle, but employment costs remain the same. And the fact is, good people will leave if they're underutilised. And that does not mean that permanent employees are unnecessary. Permanent teams are essential for organisational knowledge, continuity, culture. governance and long-term capability. The issue is expecting a permanent workforce to perfectly match a level of demand that is constantly changing and fluctuating. So to reiterate, the point I want to make with this slide is that a permanent only model often creates a very difficult trade-off. And this is why resource management cannot simply be an annual headcount exercise. We cannot decide how many people we need once a year and assume that number will remain right as priorities change, projects change, and capability requirements change. Good resource management is about understanding where demand is heading, what capability will be required, when it will be required, and for how long it will be required for. It also means accepting that the right workforce will usually include a deliberate balance, and that deliberate balance, if executed correctly, will likely be the best path to improving cost value. So let me quickly circle back on the statements that I promised I'd circle back on. I've popped them here on the slide as well. A strong permanent core provides continuity and organisational knowledge. Contingent and specialist resources provide flexibility when demand increases or when the organisation needs expertise that it doesn't require permanently. The goal is not to make everything permanent. It's not to replace permanent teams with contractors. The goal is to avoid both extremes by matching capability to demand as closely as possible. And when organisations optimise only for headcount, they usually end up with either overload or underutilisation. As I've explained in the previous slide, neither are efficient and both are very expensive in their own individual ways. I guess my point here is it goes beyond these simplistic statements on the slide here. The objective is to have the right people in the right people with the right capability, doing the right work at the right time. Perfect. Okay, we'll move on. So a quick reframe. So before I move on, I do want to make one quick distinction. There are absolutely circumstances where reducing contractor headcount is the right decision. And I've worked with clients to do that before. But I am deliberately looking at this from the other side today because in the current cost environment, contractors are very closely associated with expense, that the conversation can sometimes become too simplistic. So the key point I want to make, and this is the reframe, is that the cost of a resource should never be considered in isolation. Cheaper labour does not necessarily mean cheaper delivery. A contractor at $1,200 a day can sound expensive on paper, but if that person brings the specialist capability that helps shorten a 6-month project by a month, for example, the economics change very quickly. Or perhaps more likely, they delivered value through, I've got here on the slide, reduced governance and program overhead, lowered delay and opportunity costs, reduced risk exposure, and or earlier benefits realisation. So suddenly, the resource that looked more expensive up front may actually represent the best value across the life of the project. So importantly, the distinction I make here is one of cost versus value. And that is the reframe. Rather than asking what is the cheapest way to resource this role, the better question is what is the total cost and value of this resourcing decision? Okay, so we've spent the first part of the webinar looking at how and why these resourcing issues occur. Now I want to move into the practical takeaways that I promised. And I do want to acknowledge again that every organisation is different. Structures are different, governance is different, procurement processes are different, and importantly, the maturity of resource management varies enormously. So the next few slides are deliberately broad recommendations, and if anyone does want to have a chat specific to your organisation, I'm always happy to have a conversation to your specific circumstances. But what I've seen work really well is when organisations simply step away from their day-to-day for an hour or two, and I'm not promising that an hour or two will solve all your resource management problems, but you get the right people in the room and challenge some of those assumptions that have become normal. And sometimes the biggest improvement starts with a mindset shift, which is what I've called this slide. So let's start with the table here. If you follow me on LinkedIn, and some of your names do sound familiar, so I'm sure you do, you will probably have seen me talk about how often I hear the phrase, we need a project manager. And sometimes that is exactly what a client needs, but other times what they really need is not just another person to deliver. What they need is a specific capability or combination of capabilities, and importantly, the clarity to approach the hiring process with that understanding. To me, that is really simply an example of the difference between resource administration and resource strategy. Resource administration says, we have a vacancy, let's fill it. Resource strategy asks, what capability are we actually missing and what outcome are we trying to achieve? And that is the shift from filling vacancies to building capability on the first line of the table there. The second line is one we have already touched on today. Reducing a day rate might create a small visible saving. Reducing delivery time can create value across the entire project. One is a cost metric, the other is an organisational outcome. The same applies to headcount. If the focus is simply on controlling headcount, we can very easily lose sight of whether the organisation actually has the capability it needs to deliver. A more strategic question is, are we optimising the outcome? And the final line is simply, so the final line in a similar light is particularly relevant to specialist resourcing. We're not simply hiring people, we're deploying expertise. And often we're deploying that expertise at a very specific and critical point in a project or portfolio. So if we take those mindset shifts and make them practical, I'd like to introduce you to a little framework I have created on the second half of this slide. Like any framework, it's not intended to be prescriptive. As I've said and reiterated, every organisation has different levels of maturity, governance, and complexity, as I've mentioned. But even if you simply use these 5 steps as a checklist, it can help identify gaps in your current approach to resource management and forecasting. So I'll quickly pop through that. Give me 2 secs. Okay, so 5-step process. First, anticipate. Look ahead at what is coming, what projects are starting, where are the pressure points likely to be, what capability will we need before the demand actually arrives. Second is collaborate. Get the right people in the room, project leaders, PMO, finance, HR or procurement, delivery leads, whoever holds a piece in the picture. The quality of the forecast is only as good as the assumptions going into it. Third is align. Once you understand the demand, match the capability to the time frame. Do we need this skill permanently for 6 months, for 6 weeks? Is it something we already have internally, or is it genuinely a capability gap? Fourth is deploy. Choose the most appropriate sourcing approach for that need. Is it permanent, fixed term, contingent, internal mobility, or specialist consultancy? The point is not to default to one model. The point is to use the model that best fits that specific requirement. And finally, deliver value, because ultimately that is what all of this is trying to achieve: better outcomes, lower risk, stronger teams, and more efficient delivery overall. Okay, I just wanted to quickly touch on this slide. So to go alongside those mindset shifts, I wanted to include this visual because we've all seen some version of it before. So far, we've talked largely at a portfolio level, but we can strip resource management right back to an individual project and then start layering that thinking as we build out broader resource management plans. But what I like about this visual is that it makes the point very simple. As a project moves through its life cycle, both the level of resource demand and the capability required will change. What you need during initiation and planning is different to what you need during execution, delivery, and benefits realization. So rather than starting with who do we have available, the better question to ask is what work do we have? So start with the work. What are we trying to deliver at each stage? What capability does that require? When will we need it and for how long? Once we understand that at a project level, we can begin layering those individual demand curves across a portfolio. And that gives us a much clearer picture of where our capability gaps and resource peaks and potential risks are going to occur, ideally well before they become urgent hiring problems. Okay, so to finish, I want to come back to the title of today's webinar, The Uncomfortable Truth About Resource Management. And that is, there is no one size fits all or single resourcing model that will work across every project. Every phase or every point in time, demand changes, capability needs change, and the right answer will sometimes be permanent, sometimes contingent, and sometimes something in between. The mistake is treating those decisions too simplistically, particularly when costs become a deciding factor rather than value. I have left on the slide the more specific questions I see better performing organisations asking. I won't read them word for word, but I will tell you what they're doing. They are forecasting capability, not just counting people. They're planning for the fact that demand will change. They're using specialist expertise where it creates the most value while protecting permanent capability where continuity and organisational knowledge matter. And importantly, they're looking beyond the cost of an individual resource and asking what that individual resourcing decision does to the overall project outcome. So if there's one thing that I'd like you to leave with today, it's that resource management is not about choosing one resourcing model and applying it everywhere. It's about making the right resourcing decision for the work, the timing, and the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And ideally, again, making that decision before the need becomes urgent. Before I finish up, I want to briefly mention that our next event is our 10th PMO Leadership Symposium in Brisbane. We're holding it on the 3rd of September. We'll be bringing together PMO and project leaders for a day of practical insights, discussion and networking. So if you're Brisbane based or able to make the trip, we would absolutely love to have you there. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions if there are any now, Louise.
We don't have any in the chat. if you have any questions, by all means, either put them in the chat or you can take yourselves off mute and ask. I just have a comment, Rachel, if that's all right. Can you go back to the mindset shift slide?
Okay, absolutely. Give me 2 secs. Oh,
you know, I like that one.
there you go.
I just wanted to really make a comment on the anticipate, collaborate, align, deploy, deliver value. When I saw that, I very much put my kind of PMO advisory hat on, and just really want to make the point that whilst resourcing can sit with a whole range of people, it could sit with HR, it can sit with stream leads, it can sit all over the place. I think the best, or one of the best, if not the best, group of people to manage this is the PMO. They should have the oversight of project schedules. They should in many cases have oversight of the portfolio. So this, to me, this piece is where those two worlds of resourcing and project and portfolio planning really can come together in a very solid way. And I know a lot of organizations have challenges in this space. So it's one of the things I think that inspired Rachel to dive into this subject today. Darren, you have a question?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Rachel, Louise, probably one of the biggest challenges I see is around on the business side. So projects can't exist in a vacuum. They tap into enterprise resources, business resources across all divisions. So what are your thoughts there around sort of the resource management that's required to tap into those really time poor, often resource contention is usually a big issue there, as with those people doing their day jobs as well.
Yeah, I'll take this one, Louise. If you have anything to add, feel free. I often get asked questions around like that sort of line of thinking, and particularly around what happens when priorities are constantly changing. Like it feels like this big muddle and no one's quite understanding what's going on, and you feel like the floor's being sort of like grabbed from under you. I'd like to say that it sort of speaks more to my point about the need for continuous management, and not sort of making forecasts an annual event. So I mean, we're on the mindset shift slide here. If you're following this framework, right, and you're sort of to the point where you're collaborating, you're getting the right people in the room. And oftentimes when you create visibility around an issue like prioritization in a room full of key stakeholders, things will tend to get done. That's sort of my simple take on that. Louise, did you have anything else to add?
No, Roach, I think does that answer your question, Darren?
Yeah, it does. It does. I suppose the challenge we have is we have lots of enterprise and large scale projects going on, all tapping in, and there's often key resources within each division that are, the people who work on every single project. They're stretched thin. You don't tend to get sort of dedicated 100% allocation of resources from the business to your projects, and as a result of that, things. The consequences suffer, as your previous slides indicate, sort of thing. But it's a slightly different sort of approach when you're dealing with business resources to sort of project resources.
Well, I think yes and no, Darren. I think it's harder. I think the approach can stay the same, but I think the job that you've got is actually much harder. But we've done this with a few large and complex clients over the last couple of years, where usually in the technology space, it's particularly problematic, where you've got people who've got business as usual jobs, they've got project work, and there is a model that we use whereby we get some people around the table to represent business units, and the first time you do it probably takes 2 days. When you get the model working, it takes an hour to 2 hours a month. But I'm not going to tell you it's simple, but it's not easy. So I think the approach and the theories all work at whatever level, but as you get more granular and more fragmented workforce, it's it takes a lot of wrangling, and to have the will to take those people offline to do the exercise in the first place is kind of the first and often the greatest challenge.
I've done it in smaller organisations, Louise, and it's even a challenge in that. But then as the enterprise and the organisation scale, the complexity and the challenges get harder.
Yeah, 100%. We've got a question in the chat from Amani. On average, what's the lead time to recruit a new capability resource?
It again depends if we're talking permanent or short term. It's yeah, I do you want to clarify, Amani, whether you mean permanent capability, consulting capability, and also when you're referring to new capability, do you mean that the business has determined that they have a completely new need? And I'm just going to talk as if that is what you mean. Like
you can unmute Amani if you want to talk.
Oh yeah, feel free to unmute. Yes, new need. Okay, new need, new capability. Obviously, the important thing to. Did you want to add something there, Amani?
Thank you. Like Rachel, this is really great, very insightful in terms of the approach and the need to consider all of these dimensions, I would say. Yep, like organizations, when they need someone for a new capability or like a resource has left with that capability, jumping on to recruit a new resource, that's what they need to know, for example, in order for them to be able to cater for that, I would say, risk/lead time to ensure that they are across what's required. So here my question, would it take, for example, 2 weeks? Would it take 1 month if you need like a resource, an immediate resource to fill a gap that's resulted from, like, let's say, a sudden resignation or a sudden sort of circumstance that wasn't anticipated or planned for before?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a spanner thrown in the works for sure. When I think one of the biggest red flags I hear when I sort of when I hear companies recruiting and things is that urgent hiring need. Obviously, it's going to happen occasionally when someone just leaves, or it's urgent if a new capability is suddenly realized and there was a problem in the resource management process that was a risk that wasn't correctly identified. But yeah, absolutely, it also completely depends on the place that the job market is at any given point. I could go on, I could do a whole other webinar right now about the current state of the job market, but I would definitely be allowing a lead time of 2 months at least for a new capability resource, especially if you're assessing for a cultural fit in a permanent hire, for example, Amani. But yeah, super broad recommendation, right? Because it's so dependent on organizational circumstances. And I know I kept saying it through the entire webinar, but it is just so important to reiterate how important it is. But the more lead time you can have on finding a new capability resource, the better position that you're in.
Can I give the example of the little one we're dealing with at the moment, Rachel? People will be interested to hear this. We got asked by a long-standing client of ours to provide probably a slightly more technical resource than we would usually provide. They want somebody we've built them an assurance framework, and they want somebody who's knowledgeable in kind of Power Apps and Databricks to come and build it in their systems. So very much borderline. We kind of ring fence around those technical resources. But we said, look, we'd have a look at our network and see who we had. And we found somebody in 24 hours, somebody with the knowledge, the capability, and more importantly, the availability. That talks to the state of the market right now. So we found them. We go back to the client. When we had the first conversation, they wanted to onboard them that week, I think. So we might have had the conversation on Monday or Tuesday. They wanted them in the building by Friday. That was about 2 weeks ago. We've had a communication today to say that it's going to take a month to onboard them because they're going to need their own company laptop. They need systems access. They need a special security profile. look, I think it'll happen in less than 4 weeks, but that was the first response. I know we said we needed this now, but actually that's going to take 4 weeks. We have other clients. I mean, we've done another one this week as well, a project scheduler. 2 days from the initial conversation Rachel had to them being accepted by the client. So it really is extremely variable. But, you know, if we're given advice about how long it takes, the questions come back to you. How long are your internal processes likely to take? Because particularly in this market, we can find the capability. It's not always this easy, but it's as I say, it's extremely variable. There's 2 examples from this week.
Yeah, and I will just add that I was, by the way, Amani, answering that question from an organisational lens. Obviously, we have a network of people that we have sort of on deck and can call on as well. But when you're starting from zero, looking for a PMO lead or even a scheduler, for example, you do want to give yourself that time to properly assess for fit and capability.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Louise.
Was there any other questions? If you do have questions that you think about afterwards, please don't hesitate to shoot Rachel or myself an email. We will send out a copy of the recording. And yeah, if there's no other questions, Rachel, I'll hand back to you to sign off.
Yeah, amazing, guys. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Again, to reiterate what Louise said, if you do have any organisational specific questions or even individually specific questions, I'm always happy to have a chat, no matter what side of the market you're on at the moment. So yeah, feel free to touch base with me. I'm on LinkedIn pretty much 24/7. I don't like to admit, but that's the case. So I will get back to you pretty shortly. If you do need anything. So thanks for joining today. I really appreciate it.